And hey everyone, welcome to the first of our case studies in the non-democratic section. And we're beginning with one of the, I guess, least authoritarian or least democratic, whichever one that you really want to call it. But as I had hinted last week, we're discussing a country that every single Fox News watching right-wing loving relative of yours knows far more about than you do. Yes, it's the country that is mentioned repeatedly in conservative talk radio and on conservative news, Venezuela. They know the word, they like to use it in an argument, they really have little to no idea what the country actually is, but all they know is that Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity have told them that this is the dangers of socialism. If any of you young whippersnappers ever manage to get Bernie elected, this is what we can look forward to. In all seriousness, right? In all seriousness, Venezuela is an interesting case to look at because Venezuela was at one point probably the most developed, the most democratic, the most successful country in Latin America. And over the past 20 or so years, the country has just descended into what is effectively a failed state. And yet, at the same time, one of the biggest problems with Venezuelan politics is the outside interference that countries like the United States feel that they're justified in interfering in. Now, this doesn't make the state as bad as it is, but it certainly contributes to it. And understandings that all that needs to be done is some kind of, I don't know, CIA-sponsored regime change and, the support of some right-wing leaning, Milton Friedman sympathetic type of government will put the country back on track. The hot take that I have here is that it's that type of government that actually led to the populism of Hugo Chavez. It's that type of imbalanced economic system that created the socioeconomic inequities that led to a popular uprising that put someone like Chavez in power in 98. And, before the country started descending into chaos, actually was moving in, a direction that the United States didn't want to champion, but a direction that was, let's say, positive for social democracy. So, with that introduction here, I feel that keeping Venezuela in the collection of case studies is important for a couple of reasons. Beyond simply using, a non-European case for once. We need something to look at in Latin America. But Venezuela, out of the three countries with Russia and China, as I said, is probably the least authoritarian. But that doesn't mean that the country is successful. Venezuela we look at because it serves as a really great example of the breakdown of a consolidated democratic government into a hybrid regime, right? So remember, democracies can fail, and democracies can oftentimes descend into some kind of illiberal democratic, regime-type government, in many incantations around the world. So, if anything, Venezuela is one primary example of a hybrid regime that we discussed last week. More than that, but Venezuela also shows us the dangers of what we call a pacted transition, right? Or as the readings for this week mention, sort of a pacted government, right? A pacted transition yields a pacted government. Before we get into the specifics here, a pacted transition is the creation of a political system, a new government, through elite bargaining, right? So it is, if you were to visualize, let's say, Robert Dahl's chart, forget participation, just talk nothing more than contestation, the y-axis. So in this sense, elite bargaining, political actors, political elites are working together to create what is really an acceptable playing field of contestation and debate. Now, if the pacted government provides enough options, enough flexibility, then different opinions, different political challengers will find a place within mainstream government. But if a pacted transition is basically between the monopoly between two political parties and that's it, you better hope that politics and economics are successful enough for these two parties to govern. Because if things aren't, and the public starts looking for alternative solutions, that's when things start to fall apart. And this is what Venezuela really shows, is that when problems do happen, and this hit Venezuela in the mid to late 90s, the failure to reach any kind of political consensus and unity with non-participatory members leads to the type of hybrid regime, populist type of government that was inaugurated under Chavez. The third thing, and this is the one that is going to sort of confuse your Fox News watching relatives, is that Venezuela's failure isn't because of socialism. I don't know why they use that, but the more they repeat it, the more people just tend to accept it on faith. Venezuela's biggest problem, and this predates Chavez, in fact, this is what brought Chavez to power in 98, is that it is a rentier state. Right, and this is probably one of the most important vocab words that you'll need to know for this section. We'll get to rentier state when we get to it. And, a country that is undergoing some type of populism, national, agrarian, but a type of populist government that, in the initial period, enjoyed a certain degree of electoral support, but once in power began to entrench itself authoritatively and really is seen, not so much under Chavez, but definitely under Maduro now, as, one movement that claims to have uprooted and eliminated a previous authoritarian government, but just simply replaced it with another, just a different ideology and a different set of patrons and clients. Right? So with all of that said, right, I think Venezuela remains a very important country to look at within this class. And, currently under the increasingly erratic government of Nicolas Maduro, the successor to Chavez, Venezuela continues to function as a hybrid regime, right? A hybrid regime that has largely created a public disconnect between civil and political society. There is widespread public dissatisfaction and disengagement among the populace. And this has largely, resulted from previous dysfunctional democratic institutions. Again, we can think about how this happened and whether this is just the leadership mismanagement of first Chavez and then Maduro, or whether this is also the result of exogenous forces like the United States sanctioning Venezuela, trying to isolate it as some kind of rogue regime, which of course leads to all kinds of political, economic, and diplomatic repercussions, doesn't necessarily help the incumbent government, and it doesn't really do much to help the people. So, in a general sense here, again, for the sake of an undergraduate class, the population remains largely dissatisfied, disengaged, disillusioned from the political sphere here. And, for whatever reasons, it could be internal, could be external, the fact of the matter is that the public is increasingly just numb to the whole thing. And I think a large part of that also stems from the failure of the Chavez government on them to facilitate a strong middle class. This is something that, we go back to theories of modernization, indicate, a critical important factor for democracies. There are rich people in Venezuela, but they oftentimes are closely connected to the ruling government as well as the major oil-producing corporations. So it's more of Barrington Moore's model for what happened in Germany, right? So whatever entrepreneurial business class exists, they're small, they're fractional, and they are largely dependent on corporations, sort of pre-democratic corporate structures. So there is no autonomous, independent bourgeois class. Another element that characterizes Venezuela as a hybrid regime is there are periodic elections. This is a major feature of hybrid regimes, but it's lost on no one that the entrenched regime of Nicolas Maduro continues to win elections through a combination of patronizing those neighborhoods and public sectors that, support him and benefit from him. And then, of course, all kinds of electoral demobilization and manipulation that we talked about last week. And finally, and this is something that is less now under Maduro than it was under Chavez, but the socio-political hierarchy was largely characterized by demagogic leadership, charismatic leadership. Right, Chavez was someone who was seen as somewhat of a popular people's figure who was going to usher in a new era of leadership, of law and order, sweeping all of the previous oligarchs aside, restoring power to the ordinary people, championing the poor, nationalizing all of the major industries. This has kind of devolved more into promises than actual results. But this type of leadership is certainly, I guess, tried to, remain attached to Maduro, or at least through, the propaganda machine that supports him. So, Venezuela is, and, we'll see this more so with Russia next week, indicative of what hybrid regimes are. Not entirely authoritarian, certainly not democratic, but somewhere in the middle. And, in the middle, that hobbling along here with hopes that things might change, with every passing month. Now, before we get into the specifics of Venezuelan politics today, it's necessary to take a little step in history to figure out and understand what Venezuela was and why, someone like Chavez came to power in 1998. So, one of the terms that I introduced you to just a few minutes ago is the understanding of Venezuela being a pacted government, right? A pacted government for about 40 years between 1958 and 1998. So we begin really in, the late 50s, early 60s. And the thing to understand about Venezuelan politics is that it was a series of negotiated compromises and agreements between two political parties. Okay? We can just sort of assume that Venezuela was a two-party system between Acción Democrática, AD, and Comité de Organización Política Electoral Independiente, which we'll just simply call COPE. Okay? So two political parties, AD and COPE. And it was, by and large, a two-party electoral system in which power passed from one party to the other. Very similar to Democrats and Republicans, Christian Dems, Social Dems, Tory, Labor. Nothing to really, get excited over, but nothing to necessarily point to and say that this was problematic. Politics in Venezuela under these two parties was very much elite-driven and largely controlled by, an urban political elite that was also heavily connected to one major state industry, and that was oil, right? Venezuela is a major oil-producing country. Was back then, was now, which is the reason why the CIA is so interested in, restoring freedom and libertiness to the, poor beleaguered Venezuelans that are choking under the oppression of socialism. I got a little soapboxy there for a moment. But the understanding here is that elite bargaining provided this political consensus around what we'll call an agreeable playing field, right? An acceptable political status quo, in which both parties had more in common than they had differences. And the one thing that they worked together on, and this is very similar to what we'll find with Republicans and Democrats in the United States, is that while they appear to be opponents of one another, they also work behind the scenes to isolate, all kinds of socio-political radicalism. And when I say radical, I'm really talking about just, unconventional, unofficial political approaches, whether it's, communists, Marxists, anarchists, all kinds of, let's say, non-democratic alternatives. And, as long as the economy was stable, and as long as there was no major internal turmoil within the country, things, operated comparatively without any major problems. Now, because Venezuela was also a major oil-producing country, and we're going to get to, Rentier state in a moment here, the stability was also largely contingent on the price of oil. So if the price of oil went up and money kept coming in, that meant that there was enough revenue for both political parties, whoever controlled the government at the time, to subsidize the population, pay for investments in infrastructure and social services, and this is again nothing out of the ordinary. This is kind of how most countries work, right? When the economy is good, money comes in, you know what to do with that money, you basically invest it within the population and wash, rinse, repeat every single year, right? No problem. Until, right, we realize that, once socioeconomic and socio-political problems begin to manifest, right? And there's numerous reasons. It could be economic downturn. It could be, a poor crop yield that year. It could be a new generation just kind of thinking differently, more radical, wanting more rights, wanting more civil liberties, whatever it happens to be, right? When we look at pacted governments like Ade and Kope, as I said before, if there is, let's say, a wide enough playing field, a wide enough arena of acceptable political discourse, new ideas and challenges will find some place within the existing status quo, right? We'll be able to somehow, squeeze you in. But if the playing field is narrow and it rests largely on maintaining a type of oligarchic privileged status quo, and those without power or influence or voice are somehow managing to gain one of those three, then rather than being seen as a newcomer to the political arena, they're identified and understood to be threats to that status quo, right? Which, again, let's just use the United States as an example here. When there appears to be too much of a populist movement, not just on the right, but definitely on the Bernie Sanders agrarian left, then Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, and Ted Cruz will work all day and all night trying to make certain that the peasants don't manage to take control of this elite-driven country club. So if the playing field is narrow enough, we have this thing called, and I mentioned it in the lecture on populism, right? The cordon sanitaire, right? The cordon sanitaire, which just kind of review from the populist section, is sort of like a built-in failsafe to kind of deal with unwanted political parties that somehow manage to get past the 5% rule. Like if the threshold voting clause was put in to keep the crazies and the unwanted out, but they somehow managed to get past the X%, then cordon sanitaire kind of, blackballs them. It isolates them. In the legislature, right? They're not going to stop you from getting your seats, but we're not going to caucus or coalition or have anything really to do with you. Well, a narrow pacted government kind of does the same thing here. If cordon sanitaire keeps these parties out of any kind of discussion, cooperation, coalition, these movements remain blocked. And, in less democratic countries, if they become too influential, they're kind of driven underground. And, if you remember sort of the do's and don'ts of a hybrid regime, you drive your opponents underground at your own risk. Because once you're kind of driven out of, official power, doesn't mean that they, devolve and evaporate. No. Driving them underground actually keeps them radical, makes them even more uncompromising, and turns them into, a party of and a movement of position. So in other words, if they ever do get power, they're going to remember the days when they were, blackballed, and they're not going to want to have anything to do with you either. But that means that, the status quo is now critically endangered. So, a pacted government doesn't necessarily constrain flexibility, but if pacted government has too narrow of an acceptable playing field, especially if it, involves just, privileging and empowering a small percentage of the country's political elite, then things are going to be much more problematic during rapid socioeconomic change, right? When the economy is good, everything's great. When the economy, turns downward, the status quo is blamed, but if there's no room for a solution, people will be looking for alternative ideas outside of that acceptable playing field. So, pacted governments place a lot of emphasis on institutional strength instead of social preferences. And that's the reason why, right, I spend all this time trying to tell you about the differences between democracy as practice versus structure. Pacted governments put all of your eggs in the basket of structure. And it just simply assumes that the economy is going to continue to chug away, and the status quo will be reassured. But when things go wrong, and, trust me, things have gone wrong, a lot, we kind of see what democracy as practice will do, not within democracy as structure, but against democracy as structure. So the thing to understand about Chavez is that this is not some military coup. This isn't some assault on democracy, but it was kind of seen as a rescue of democracy. It was seen as a populist movement that aimed to rectify the wrongs of democracy. All right, let me try to put this into more of a visual format that you might be able to see. When we talk about a pacted government, what we really need to think about is, all right, how many political parties, how many factions, how many political groups are part of this pacted government? And if we're talking about more than two, right, especially within a proportionally representative system here, where you've got, a number of parties, both on the right and the left, if this is the wide enough acceptable playing field, then whenever there's a problem, one of these parties is going to, capitalize on that, but the system itself will not be undermined. The constitutional order will not be replaced. We just simply change one party for the next. No big deal with that. In the case of Venezuela, and this is, increasingly problematic when we examine more developing countries in the global south, right? So whether this is the Middle East or Latin America or even Southeast Asia, right? The playing field is very limited. And we find that the playing field really only benefits, the upper echelons of political society, the urban elite of Caracas, and the countryside and the periphery, if they're even considered at all, is just disregarded. So, non-conventional political movements really have two choices. They can either, like the yellow colors here, moderate their views in order to fit in with that playing field, but that kind of compromises their beliefs. And some of them could be, would be authoritarian movements that now moderate themselves, or they could be parties that have all the right answers. They could be, parties that have the best solutions for the country, but they've got one of two choices. They can either A, moderate and compromise their principles to be accepted, or they can stick to their guns and they can say, no, this is what we believe in, this is what needs to happen. But by refusing to be part of the acceptable playing field, now these parties are perceived to be problematic, to be a threat, to be understood as internal contagion. So, it's one thing to sort of say, look, the industries need to be renationalized. We need to diversify our economic development beyond the U.S. Imposed, oil-producing sectors. We need to create greater degrees of political rights and civil liberties. And, if you're seen as problematic to that, well, then you're not going to conform to the system, but you're going to fight the system. You're going to all of a sudden look at the playing field as something that needs to go. And your first target is the constitutional order itself. Okay? And this is what describes, this is how Venezuela came to, produce the perfect storm. Because throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever, Venezuela was and still remains a rentier state. Okay? Now, I'm going to be pretty certain, all right, that your Fox News watching relatives don't know what a rentier state is because Tucker or Sean or Greta or whoever, never bothered to figure out what this is. A rentier state is one that is characterized by the underdevelopment of all economic sectors other than one raw material, other than one specifically invested, hyper-invested sector. Now, this usually is oil, but it can also be diamonds, it can be bananas, it can be rubber, it can be palm oil, it can be natural gas. In other words, a rentier state is one in which the entire economy, the entire economic health of the country rests almost entirely on the revenue generated from the exportation of one particular product, right? One natural resource. So, Venezuela is certainly not the only oil-producing state in the world, right? We've got Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, we've got United Arab Emirates. To a lesser extent, we had Libya. When we talk about oil, when we talk about, let's say, natural gas, we could look at perhaps Russia, although Russia is a bit more of a diversified rentier state. We've got natural gas and oil. Diamonds, certainly within many of these sub-Saharan African countries, still, operated and controlled by the De Beers company, so, when, your, significant other went to Jared, you can, rest assured that that diamond came out of some African mine, where the economy rests entirely on that diamond extraction. So the understanding of a rentier state is it's basically putting, proverbially, all of your eggs in one basket, right? And depending on the price of that good remaining stable, if not increasing, and the demand for that product remaining as high as it is. So the state remains dependent on the revenue from this resource. And while this isn't necessarily true for Venezuela, at least not back then, but when we look at countries like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, they're full-blown autocracies, and they're able to get away with it by basically taking all that money from oil, whatever it is, and subsidizing the population, or at the absolute least subsidizing enough of the population that will support their retention in power, right? So there's no taxation. Right? There's no, there's no April the 15th that comes around, right? The government basically will pay for the roads, the schools, will, pay for the security apparatus, finance the military, increase business, do all that kind of good stuff. So, there's a wonderful aspect about this, right? You don't have to pay taxes, but no taxation means no representation either, right? There's no need for you to be represented because you're not paying your way through this. So, when we talk about rentier, it's really a type of subsidized authoritarian system. As long as the price of that product remains good and the money comes in, well, then it's a stable system. But rentier states rarely transform the economy, right? We're not talking about a system that empowers everyone. And, it might raise the, the general collective standard of living, but rentier states are those that, they don't subsidize everyone equally, right? Goods and, goods and services are, go first and foremost to those areas that are loyal to the state. Especially if there's elections that come in, right? So it's, it provides patronage, all sorts of graft and corruption. Those that run the state are the ones that, get the first, cut of that annual sum. And, we'd like to think that it's invested, like I said, across the country. It isn't. It's invested in those sectors, those neighborhoods that benefit and vote for, right, the ruling parties. So when it comes to Venezuela, right, Ade and Cope, I mean, they kind of share the same urban neighborhoods, the same schools, the same, services. So the money goes basically to Ade and Cope electorate. Those in the countryside have to kind of rely on whatever is left after everyone else sort of takes their cut. Right? So when the dependence is on oil, right, it means that the country is basically vulnerable to booms and busts, right? So when the oil is flowing and gas is, $3 a gallon, you're doing fine, right? You're absolutely doing fine. And the problem with these countries is that you never look at a boom year and think of that as a bubble. You always think of boom years as your new baseline, right? So you never really plan for busts. If you're smart enough, you might, store away some cash for, let's just say that next year the price of gas goes down, or there's some kind of major crisis around the world where no one's buying as much as they used to. If you plan ahead, you might think to yourself, okay, a boom year, we're not going to increase investment, or we're not going to spend on lavish goods. We've just got, we got a rainy day fund for in case things happen down the road, right? It's kind of like, people with money. Some of you save up all the time. Others will, in one pocket, kind of out the next. So when those years come, when oil prices decline, this will lead to these petrostates borrowing money, right, to offset costs, not just on lavish expenditures, but paying off your clients, right? Paying off all sectors of the society to maintain loyalty and stability. And when, a decline in oil prices happen, and, the big one was in 1996 in Venezuela, this led to an erosion, not just of the political legitimacy of those in power, but began to unravel the stability of the Pacted governments, right? Because people started looking more and more towards non-conventional political alternatives, because Ade and Copé really didn't really know what they were doing. And, that's why I feel like we need to understand Hugo Chavez coming to power, not surprisingly, in 1998, right? So there's a little bit of a backstory here that I need to give you first in order to have you understand what happened in 98. Let me just go back to the previous slide here so you can kind of listen in but read this stuff again. The big year was 1996, right? This comes before most of your time here, but I don't even remember why it happened, but I do remember I was fresh out of high school, and this was great for me. 1996, the price of gas for the first time in my memory started dropping. And I don't mean by like 5 cents or 10 cents. I mean like the price of gas started plummeting. Back then, gas was, and this is going to sound ridiculous compared to where we are today, but like the average price of gas was, let's say, $1.65. Like $1.85, if you were like in Jersey City and you were about to go into the Holland Tunnel or something like that, like $1.85 a gallon, which is today that's a bargain, right? But I noticed the summer of '96, right? I was already a freshman in college. And we went from $1.85 to $1.65 to $1.50, and then it was like $1.35, $1.25. As like the days and the weeks went by, and I was like, "Are we actually going to get below $1?" Like I never remember that happening, right? And then it happened. It was like 95 cents. I remember, I don't know why I was around Deptford, New Jersey at the time. I just remember this. The price of gas at a gas station in Deptford was 80 cents a gallon. And I remember tanking up my car, giving the attendant $10 and getting change back. I almost felt compelled to be like, here, keep the change. Go buy yourself something nice here. You need it, right? And so for the consumer, this is fantastic. It's like, I can't believe how cheap gas is. But for a rentier state, you're starving. You're cash starved. Because if you're paying that low at the pump, you're not paying that higher from extracting it from the country. You're probably even paying it cheaper. So the problem that we have to understand is that in a rentier state without any kind of real democratic participation, representation, even though Venezuela was, an electoral democracy, it wasn't a consolidated. And if everything rests on the price of oil, whatever it is, subsidizing everybody, think about it like this. You get, right, your annual revenue, and you have to pay off, right, certain sectors of the country in order to maintain loyalty and patronage. So who's the first group that you pay off? Let's say you're in charge of a rentier state, right? It could be Venezuela, it could be Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, it doesn't matter, okay? The first group of people that you pay off is yourself, right? You take the first cut and you put that away in a Swiss bank account, a Cayman Island account. That's your, that's not your rainy day fund. That's your if I need to flee the country fund. Okay, so if there's any investment in the future of any future securities, it's your security, right? So that's the first cut, is your inner circle. The second group that gets their cut is the industry that the rentier state is built on. And this isn't just because the oil industries are demanding it. It's that the bulk of your industrialized infrastructure rests in that, right? You don't have a diversified economy. Everything revolves around oil extraction. So you need to pay the workers. You need to pay for the upkeep. You need to pay your international backers and donors as well. So after you pay yourself, you pay the industry that produces all the money. The third group of people that you pay is your secret security services. And we're not talking about the cops on the beat, but we're talking about, the specialized military that has a, particular loyalty to the state and your regime. Sounds very sultanistic. But these are the ones that are far better trained, far better equipped, and have just as much to lose because they're part of this, I don't want to say secret police, but definitely the state police, the gendarmerie. So that's the third group that you pay off. Fourth group are your constituents, your political groups. You want to subsidize them, pay off, for roads, schools, hospitals, water, treatment, all those kinds of good stuff that we like to talk about as part of patronage. You patronize them, they vote for you. It's just that simple. Fifth group are the military. Sixth group are the local police. And by the time you get to the outer layers, if there's any money left, maybe then you might feel inclined to invest in, some opposition neighborhood just to maybe get a few more votes, right? Like a new roller skating rink or something, anything. I don't really know, right? But you kind of see the hierarchy of groups that you have to pay off in order to maintain this leverage on power. Now, if 1 year was really good and you all got the equivalent of, let's say, bonuses, they're not seen as bonuses. Most of these groups expect the same amount of money to be given the following year. And that's not even including the cost of living going up or just infrastructure requiring further upkeep. But it's like, you go to AC and you walk into the casino with $100. And, you play the poker table, you play blackjack, At some point in the evening, you're up to $500, right? You walk in with 100, you're up to 500. And half of you, if you're thinking about this, is like, okay, quit while you're ahead, walk out, right? You walked in with 100, you walk out with an extra 400, good night. But what happens if you play the next hand after 500? And you have a really good hand and you double it. You're at 1,000 now, okay? Ooh. And then you play again and you lose $400. Now you're down to 600. And then you decide to walk out. How do you see your night? Do you walk out? You walked in with 100, you walk out with 600. At one point you had 1,000. Do you see yourself as walking out with $500 up? Or do you remember the 400 that you lost? Rentier states have the risk of one of these sectors recognizing, hey, I'm not 500 up. I had 1,000 at one point. I want that back. So states are beleaguered to find the money for that. Now, you're going to pay yourself first. You're going to pay the industry. So the money is still going to be paid off in full to the upper layers. But once you start underfunding the outer layers, right? We're not even talking about political opposition, but how about, the local cops? How about, the grunts in the military? At some point, you might not even have the money to pay off your own subsidized electorate. Maybe not as much as you did the year before. You better hope and pray that the following year you have a better uptake. This is what happened in Venezuela, right? 96, 97, the price of gas almost got to a point where, again, for the consumer, this was phenomenal. For the producer, the countries were risking bankruptcy. And it's not a surprise that after 96, 97, when the price of gas went back up, two things happen around the world. A, Chavez comes to power in Venezuela, and B, Iran starts looking for the development of nuclear weapons. Because at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, Iran was basically begging Bill Clinton to open up dialogue, right? The country was on the verge of going bankrupt. The idea was to reach out to the United States for the first time since the Iranian Revolution and begin to start talking some negotiated settlements, one of which would have allowed them access to a whole bunch of overseas frozen accounts that were otherwise untouchable by the Iranian regime and had been collecting interest since 79. We're talking about almost 20 years. It's a good chunk of change here. So a lot of these petro-states began to really sweat until about 2000, 2001, when, of course, the war on terror shoots the price of gas sort of back up. But it's within this rapid socioeconomic period of change that Hugo Chavez, a political outsider, sort of a radical, I would say, on the political scale, he's definitely more of a Latin American leftist, a socialist in that sense, ends up coming into power. And he's elected into office on this large protest vote, especially after campaigning within the countryside, right? So it's not like the urban elite decide that this guy is going to usher in change, but it is the periphery that is now suffering the most, that puts their faith behind him, right? Plus he comes from the military, so he's got a military-like background. So he, campaigns on, stabilization, order, and punishing those that have impoverished large chunks of the population. So, he leads on a notion of populism, democratic populism, promises of, empowering the people. He's got charismatic leadership. He's seen as someone who is from the countryside. He's not an insider. He's not an aristocrat. And, by appealing to the public pressure for radical change, Chavez's election in 98 was widely seen at the time as a major victory for progressive democratic politics. This was not a military coup. This was not some subversion of the electoral process. Chavez comes to power through relatively clean and fair elections. Largely on the narrative of juxtaposing between the corruption, the nepotism, the oligarchism of the incoming government, and promising to, kick them all sort of out of power. So by dichotomizing in a very populist way the us versus them, the traditional, the honorable Venezuelans versus the corrupt urban elite who have who are in bed with American imperialists and corporatists and other elements like that, right? He comes in on this public mandate promising to enact sweeping political change. So he has this almost public mandate to, lead from, an executive top-down type of organization, which is popular at first, but over the years ends up becoming more and more autocratic. So, once the honeymoon period is sort of, is over, and this is, definitely by the mid 2000s, we note that Chavez has eroded the legitimacy of the legislature, and all but eliminated the independent activities, the autonomy of judicial authority. So this is kind of where populism is, gives us a good example of how it can turn into authoritarianism if left unchecked. Venezuela, even today, does not deny that it operates through some form of democratic practice. But as a way of rectifying a whole bunch of structural imbalances, institutional mismanagement, and this was more so under Chavez, this is more legitimately accepted under Chavez than Maduro, leadership circumvents formal institutional arrangements. Right? So there's no checks and balances, there's no harmonization between legislative, executive, judicial. You might think, well, fusion of powers, right? There is no fusion of powers. Venezuela is a presidential system. So it's much more like that of the United States, where you have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial system operating independently, but also in some kind of cooperation. Chavez's original plan, the so-called Plan Bolivar, he likes to model himself off of his big fan in history, Simon Bolivar, as it is sort of like by 2000. This is kind of like his 10-year plan, his 12-year plan, whatever. It was a way of mobilizing the armed forces to kind of like be a civil corps of engineers in building houses, distributing food, clearing land, providing education, right, is a very type of activist, grassroots type of movement, which might be seen as very popular among the periphery and among the poor. But it really was a type of mobilization of the military to get things done outside of the formal structures and procedures of politics, right? So any opposition would be met with, severe, swift condemnation. They'd be branded as enemies of the state, people that are against progress or just pro-American stooges, whatever it is that, you want to call it. And while American media has been relentless in trying to castigate Chavez as, a little more than just a, tin pot dictator, he'd had, openly and unapologetically said that he modeled his leadership off of people like Muammar Gaddafi, Robert Mugabe, and, his then big BFF at the time, Fidel Castro, which doesn't really do much for, Venezuelan public opinion, but obviously in American media, if you basically say that you are an ally of Fidel Castro, that just raises all sorts of, sirens and red flags in the State Department, in the Treasury, in the media, whatever. I mean, Fidel is, the absolute enemy of the state here, and Chavez kind of is now modeling himself on like being, Fidel Jr. Now, forget the jingoism and memories of failed American foreign policies. His modeling of his leadership after Castro was done in a way of, let's say, pitting the underprivileged masses, against the previously empowered elites and economic sectors, right? So we're going after those that had stolen from the state, the landlords, the rich, the powerful, the wealthy that had hoarded all the money and prevented it from, reaching the hands of everyone else. I mean, it sounds a lot more noble. It's much more of a Robin Hood type of narrative. And it might actually be far more truthful than anything you'd hear in American media. But, Chavez was somebody that did not play along with U.S. foreign policy. And here's the thing, though. If you know anything about American foreign policy and Latin America, it's pretty bad. American foreign policy likes to look at everything south of the Rio Grande as like, glorified colonies, economic colonies, right? We absolutely love right-wing dictatorships in Latin America because they tend to be big adherents to the Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek type of market fundamentalist models. Just a couple of weeks ago in Bolivia, the previous president who had come to power through some kind of like right-wing coup, what was her name? Janine Áñez, who had overthrown the left-wing popular government of Evo Morales, Morales comes back into power and kind of, sort of undoes the coup, throws Áñez in jail, and the woman was basically an apologist for fascism, a unrelenting evangelical Christian who felt that it was her duty to just kind of persecute the indigenous populations with free market fundamental capital and the Bible. She's now arrested, thrown in jail. And of course, the State Department now under Biden thinks that this is the worst thing possible. This is another assault on democracy. We love right-wing governments in Latin America, and we cannot suffer left-wing. So, before there was Evo Morales in Bolivia, there was Hugo Chavez in Venezuela who had, upset the oil industry that the United States had previously benefited significantly from through ADE and COPE. So it's not a surprise that Chavez is going to be demonized. And, when he's hanging out with people like Castro, or even worse, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was the then president of Iran, it's just like, okay, so Chavez is one of these rogue states, one of these American-hating left-wing socialists that, through American media is, turned into a big enemy. And of course, making fun of George W. Bush and being against American foreign policy at the time, makes us all like, well, who the hell are you? Who is this little, upstart? And, what's his whole thing? He's not the most diplomatic. He's not the most, he doesn't really adhere to protocol. So he's not, someone who is just misunderstood, but he is kind of blunt, or was kind of blunt, right? And he had no problems kind of appearing to be some kind of, bloke that had just kind of seized the state. So, in this sense, Chavez does have this combination of, popular support, but he is a, top-heavy executive autocrat. And, pretty, shortly after he comes to power, he immediately starts rewriting and reshaping the Constitution of Venezuela. So by 1999, the Constitution was, rewritten, reshaped to give further powers to the executive branch, to effectively rule by decree, right, indeterminately. So it's just one of those things where it doesn't matter who it is. If the balance of power, if the separation of powers, which has all sorts of checks and balances, is now coming undone, and there is greater power given to the executive branch to either bypass the legislature or just turn the legislature into a rubber stamp, well, it doesn't matter who's in charge. That's an assault on democracy as structure. And, this can be argued in the name of, quick fix political solutions, right? We got to get stuff done. We got to get the country back on track. We got to reorient the country away from this horrible rentier model. And if it's being done in the name of some revolutionary long-term idea, well, then we as the argument goes, give it time, give it 5 years, give it 10 years, and once things are better, we'll reorient power back to sort of the way that it was. That's a promise that rarely is met. And even if it is, right, even if it is met in 5 years, in 10 years, what happens in between that time, right? What's the fallout? What happens to the opposition? What happens to accountability? What happens to checks and balances? If the executive branch is given undue amounts of power and influence, well, that just gives them imbalanced scrutiny over any opposition from the legislative or judicial branches, or any kind of opposition, challenges, throwbacks, obstacles from the economic sectors. And if Chavez can just simply call on either the military to put down the opposition, or harness the people power to, just kind of demonstrate in the street, there's really no element that can keep him or his new party in check. And of course, what we find by, 2001, 2, 3, is that there's not much of a redistribution, right? It's not like Venezuela ceases to be a rentier state. It's just that new leadership continues to control the oil revenue, but instead of the money going to this group of patrons, it's now going to those groups over there, right? So it's kind of the same thing. You pay yourself, you pay the industry, you pay the security apparatus, new people, you pay your new constituents, you pay your new neighborhoods. So it's just we're redirecting the gravy train away from one group of people that were able to eat at the trough for 40, 45 years, and now it's new people. Put on your bib, and I hope you're hungry. And so, there's not much in terms of, let's say, real revolutionary change as there is just, paying off new constituents to vote. Right? So, Chavez has, sort of bought the loyalty of the poor. And in so doing, right, he turns himself into a veritable demagogue, and which, of course, plays to his advantage as, new elections come up. Now, he does win. He does win re-election through free and fair elections in 2002. However, what gave him more of this anti-American streak by '02 was an attempted coup that may or may not have been orchestrated by the CIA in 2001, right? A coup that failed. And there's the only thing worse than a coup is one that fails, because the party and the leadership that survives is now going to become increasingly paranoid. And they're going to be looking for anyone and anything that might have colluded with the United States within the country. So after '02, Chavez becomes increasingly anti-capitalist, anti-American, anti-Western. The United States, for its part, remember, this is '02, '03. We're at the height of American jingoistic patriotism. This is the age of freedom fries, freedom toast, Team America World Police. We hate the French more than we hate Al-Qaeda. And who is this ugly little pug in Venezuela bad-mouthing America? So, we're going to do everything in our power to isolate the country until, Chavez sees the error of his ways or the people remove him. So being left with few options, right, Chavez starts hanging out with all other kinds of global miscreants and malcontents. Gaddafi, Ahmadinejad, of course, Castro, and that, of course, just reaffirms the narrative in American society that this guy is just one of the bad guys. And the thing is that, say what you want, him getting reelected to power just further consolidates his grip on authority. And of course, now that he's looking for enemies, he's now going to pursue them with greater vigor. And even people that are seen to be mild competitors to his grand vision for the country, right, real or imagined, are going to be suspect. They're either going to be expelled, incarcerated, disenfranchised politically. And of course, this is going to make the country more and more autocratic, which leads us to, comfortably hypothesize that Venezuela under Chavez became much more of a hybrid regime than any rudimentary, limited, pacted democratic government prior to that. So, through Plan Bolivar, through his, mobilization of the military where the officers were loyal to him, right, he's able to circumvent Congress, which, you can make the argument, hey, the legislature just takes too much time debating and thinking and a lot of paperwork, just quick fix solutions. And yes, from an autocratic standpoint, that has all the legitimacy. If your goal is to promote democracy as a form of government, well, you got to work with one of those three branches. So you can't circumvent Congress, and you can't really disregard the judiciary either. If the judges rule against the constitutionality of something, again, in a democratic system, you got to kind of defer to the judicial system. You don't fire the judges and then replace them with loyalists. And speaking of stacking the deck, all public works authorities, especially within the oil industry, are going to be, the previous workers are going to be sacked. They're going to be replaced with people that are more loyal, more compliant with the Chavez regime. So you're basically just creating a larger system of clientelism and patronage, which will empower your own group, but increasingly alienate, disassociate, and isolate, your enemies, your rivals, and any opposition, either at home or abroad. I don't think Chavez really cared that much about that. As far as he was concerned, his opposition were all U.S. puppets. Maduro is even more adamant in believing that, especially when the United States seems to really, really, really put their support behind this new guy, Juan Guaido, whom, this is actually interesting, the United States has decided to recognize Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. Right? He's kind of like president without an office or without portfolio, but it's like the United States just chooses to recognize him as president as opposed to Maduro. This, of course, makes Guaido just completely and utterly suspect within his country. He might be loved by the Venezuelan diaspora here, but when he goes back to Caracas, when he goes back to Venezuela, he's seen as just a U.S. puppet. So, it doesn't really do him any good. Before we, jump to Maduro now, I just want to finish up by talking about how this, Plan Bolivar, how this state-sponsored memory of Simon Bolivar, this major Latin American revolutionary, is used to kind of create a sense of populist patriotism that seeks national unity plus inclusion with the country's indigenous tribal identities. Right? There's another big thing that a lot of these left-wing populists of Latin America like to do. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is something that's revolutionary and ingenious. But, Chavez, Evo Morales, these political groups give far more leverage, mobility, and privilege to the indigenous populations of their respective countries, as opposed to more right-wing governments, which are kind of like neo-colonial, right? They're oftentimes populated by people who have direct lineage back to Spain or to Portugal. So the Plan Bolivar is not just seen as some, 10-year plan to make Venezuela great again, but it's a way of mobilizing, getting active in getting the indigenous, previously disregarded and ignored groups involved in the political as well as civil process. Now, when I taught this class about 10 or so years ago, I would end with the question of whether or not Chavez was ever going to step down, whether he was going to be removed from office, whether he was finally going to play his last, play his last hand, or whether he would remain president for life. After his re-election in 2002, he basically rewrites the Constitution to allow him to run for office indefinitely. And by Obama's presidency, right, things start to take a turn for the worst, right? Venezuela can kind of benefit during the Bush Jr. years because the popularity of George W. Bush beyond, Albania, was incredibly low around the world, right? So Chavez could kind of, bank on the idea that he's, just taking pot shots, little insults at Bush and Cheney about how dumb they are and how much they miscalculated the war on Iraq. When Obama comes to office, and, this is Obama of 2008, when people actually believed that he was a, social progressive, Chavez can't play that card anymore. He cannot badmouth America. Obama just is sort of like the darling of the world at the time. And there's a few things that we begin to realize. Chavez's radical plan for development really had little impact beyond the planning board. It doesn't mean that left-wing strategies fail. It's just that he never got around to really changing the structure. He just simply, brought new people in in the system of patronage and clientelism. So, Chavez's Venezuela becomes noticeably impoverished by '08. I mean, international isolation, economic sanctions, and just continues to become more isolated by Obama's presidency. And as Obama begins to re-engage the world and sort of mend fences with many of America's detractors under Bush, Venezuela just kind of loses international support. Not only that, but his BFFs around the world, step down from power. Ahmadinejad, was voted out. Castro initially retired. Gaddafi was killed in the Libyan revolution. So, Chavez is running out of friends. He's running out of people that he could, look to, work with, cooperate. And then shortly afterwards, he dies. As a matter of fact, he dies before Castro does. Chavez ends up, getting some kind of cancer. Is able to get some, pretty decent medical treatment in Havana. But he dies without leaving any real heir apparent, without any real successor. And, with that, the charismatic leadership of Plan Bolivar, dies with him. So what does he leave in his wake? The opposition is completely destroyed, scattered, leaderless, discredited. And I guess through a public wave of sympathy, his number two, his deputy vice president, deputy whatever, whoever he was, Nicolas Maduro, kind of steps in. Now, here's the thing. Maduro is widely regarded as inept, right? He just does not have the leadership skills. He doesn't have the diplomatic acumen. But he's one of those people that is given access to power. He realizes that he likes it and he doesn't know what else he's going to do. So he just continues to use the leverage of power in a hybrid regime to transform the country into more and more of an authoritarian state. But just without the charisma, without the leadership, and really without the same degree of public support. So he remains in power today, largely through more, tried and true tactics of hybrid regime politics, opposition demobilization, basically outright bribing large sectors to continue to vote for him. And this doesn't do Venezuela any favors, right? Especially as American media, and this is not just conservative stuff. This is CNN, this is MSNBC, this is all sorts of stuff, right? Likes to point to Venezuela and say, this is a country that in less than 50 years, went from a paragon of democracy, I wouldn't go that far, but run with the narrative, to the visual representation, exhibit A, B, and C, of the dangers of socialism. Now, this is more played up on Fox News than on CNN, MSNBC, but there's a good degree of schadenfreude that runs through the political gamut from Donald Trump all the way to Elizabeth Warren, okay? And look, American foreign policy has been actively involved in undermining, right, the credibility of an already discredited leader. But U.S. foreign policy doesn't look at Venezuela as anything other than a potential market for oil that has been put on indefinite hiatus since the mid-1990s. So while the United States can talk about democracy in the country, and while they can talk about the plight of political rights and civil liberties, and while they can look at barren shelves in supermarkets and say this is not because of economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the horrors of the rentier state. No. This is what socialism will bring you, right? In fact, I remember about a year ago, or it's about a year into COVID, And you get these memes on social media that looks at empty shelves in ShopRite and Wegmans and something like that, right? And one of my personal favorites is like, this is life under socialism. Oh wait, no, this is the ShopRite in the United States. Oh no, wait, this is Wegmans. This is capitalism, right? So the United States is really not playing fair with the country, right? As far as they're concerned, they've hedged their bets behind Juan Guaido, who, like Janine Áñez, is some, right-wing corporatist that's more than happy to take American money and, realign the country in a way that would make Henry Kissinger and, Hillary Clinton smile. And, as a result, the disastrous leadership, not just of Maduro, but, the failures of Chavez in creating this newer, sort of democratic, social, utopian state, has branded the country as emblematic of what happens when you turn your back on capitalism or when you engage in managed economic development. So, this type of Cold War-esque policies, foreign policies, are still alive and well. What's missing, of course, is the very discussion of what a rentier state is. I challenge you to find any group, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, Business Insider, whatever it is you want to call it, right? Whatever it is. I guarantee you they will not talk about rentier states. Bring that up. Next time, if you have a family member that likes to use, Venezuela as a problem of socialism, just say rentier state, and then you're like, what? Right? They don't know what it is, right? But this is one of the big problems. I would say if Venezuela's got if the biggest problem, besides Maduro, is the rentier state model. So the choices before Venezuela are kind of stark right now. And, the country continues to, just deteriorate under Maduro. But there's no real credible political alternative right now, right? If right now the choice before Venezuelans is continue to support this bloke or sort of, lay down your guard and let the CIA put Guaido in. He's, some, Pete Buttigieg, whatever it is. Then we're not going to really improve. We're going right back to the, narrow pacted government that led to the populist, movement, mobilization that put Chavez in power. Is there any real democratic alternative to the country? If there is, we haven't found them out yet. Right? We don't know really who they are. So, Venezuela is... as I said, it's a country that, in comparison to Russia and China, is probably the least authoritarian, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have problems. In fact, it's the least authoritarian, but it's also the most impoverished. The quality of life there has just completely, plummeted. The country has gone from one of the most developed to one of the least stable regimes in Latin America. It has been listed for the last number of years as not free. In Freedom House. The only other country that gets that ignoble designation in Latin America is Cuba. So Venezuela, continues to be seen as, like Cuba, right, a rogue state. And it doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Biden or, Clinton or, anyone else, except maybe, Sanders. Or maybe AOC, I don't know, right? But the general attitude among, American foreign policy, whether it's Republican or neo-lib dem, is that Venezuela's problems are that they just have deviated from the American model, and America would love to intervene and save the Venezuelan people from their own inept misery. So until that time, right, Venezuela is just going to be seen as a rogue state with the hope that eventually the population will rise up and overthrow Maduro. That doesn't seem to be happening, right? He does have ways of entrenching himself, and as long as the opposition remains demobilized or delegitimized, unfortunately the status quo will continue. And within that time, the increased control of power at the top will erode whatever credibility, whatever political rights and civil liberties remain. So, non-presidential institutions in Venezuela remain poor, dysfunctional, underfunded, and overwhelmingly corrupt. This leads, right, to wide-scale perceptions among the citizenry that nothing can happen, and this sense of citizen disengagement, a culture of disappointment, just turns them off from politics, especially when a good chunk of the population is more interested in just trying to survive, trying to make a living, trying to get through a disastrous economy with an overwhelmingly inflated currency. So as far as they're concerned, right, they don't have time to think about civil society and good governance. They would like it, but they're more interested in just trying to get through the day-to-day activities. And once that happens, status quo, hybrid regimes, status quo is able to survive. It's able to make it until the next day, simply because there's no credible opposition, nor is there any real organized challenge, except from the United States. And once that happens, the public will organize, and they will hate to support Maduro, but they'd rather have this guy in power than another Washington puppet like Guaido. Okay? All right, so that is our first coverage. I hope that this was informative. I hope that you learned a lot, and I hope that you've got a lot of information to kind of take to your next family gathering whenever your relatives start talking about how bad Venezuela is. You can give them all that they have never, ever, ever heard from Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham. But that's just, part of the charm. It's an extra bonus for taking this class. All right, so I look forward to your comments and your input as always in class on Thursday. Keep the discussion posts coming. Next week, Russia. It's a good one. You're not going to want to miss that one. All right, so I'll see you in a couple of days and enjoy the rest of this one. Take care, all.